Okay.
Yep, that's great. Okay, well, look, I think we'll start, and hopefully we'll have more people coming on. In fact, people are coming on as we speak. My name's Mike Moynard. I'm the chair of the La Trobe University Art History Alumni, having taken over from Esther, who did such a fantastic job in the last few years, and so I look forward to working and supporting the chapter, and also getting to know all of our members. Before we start, I would like to just give an acknowledgement of country that our meeting here in, I mean, we're all over the place, but in Melbourne, and particularly where I am in Bundoora, is being held on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. And I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. So it's with great pleasure that I look forward to this lecture this afternoon by Adelina, who is a member of our chapter, and is also on our committee. And it's wonderful to I think this has been in the making for some time, Adelina, this talk.
Yes.
So it's very fantastic that we're now able to have Adelina present it. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Esther to introduce our speaker. Thanks, Esther.
Thank you, Michael, and lovely to see you all again. Adelina Modesti will be familiar to many of us, not least due to the lecture she gave us in 2020, which was titled Visual Self-Fashioning at the Medici Court of Vittoria della Rovere, and the Role of Portraits. And of course, also the fact that she has taught at La Trobe and was an Australian Research Council postdoctorate fellow at La Trobe from 2008 to 2011 for her project Mapping Matrons. And also for many years, she was an honorary associate in art history at La Trobe. And as Michael mentioned, she's also a member of our committee now. And we're very glad that Adelina agreed to join. But Adelina is the kind of scholar who goes to the coalface. She spent decades delving into archives in Florence and Bologna, discovering the evidence for the employment of women and for their artistic and teaching practices in the courts of northern Italy, and making connections that lead to coherent narratives from this evidence. And this has all given us a richer and more detailed picture of the presence of female artists in these influential courts. Adelina is now a senior fellow in the School of Culture and Communication at Melbourne University, and a researcher with the ACIS-IDEA Digital Humanities Project, Textiles, Trade and Meaning in the Courts of Early Modern Italy during the time of Isabella d'Este. Also, together with Dr. Consuelo Lollobrigida, she is co-editor of the new Brapol series, Women in the Arts. And I might add, this will be a very prestigious publication that draws on the immense amount of research that is now taking place in this field by scholars all over the world. Adelina's research focuses on early modern women's cultural production, female patronage, and transnational cultural exchange. She has published monographs on Elisabetta Sirani and Vittoria della Rovere, and essays on Artemisia Gentileschi, Margherita de' Medici, and the textile practices production of Florentine nuns and court ladies. Currently, Adelina is preparing a volume on Elisabetta Sirani for the pioneering Lund Humphreys series, Illuminating Women Artists. All of these achievements and continuing projects demonstrate her vital interest in uncovering the hitherto neglected female artists and textile workers of the early modern period. And this is also ongoing in her work as an AWA advocate in Florence for the Advancing Women Artists Foundation. Artemisia Gentileschi has enjoyed a well-deserved period in the limelight over the last few years with a number of travelling exhibitions and publications that are the culmination of many decades of research into and a reappraisal of her work. But the two artists that Adelina will be talking about today, Lavinia Fontana and Elisabetta Sirani, not only occupy slightly different time periods to Gentileschi. Fontana worked before her and Sirani came afterwards, but they also hailed from Bologna, where a somewhat different cultural climate prevailed. So this lecture on un paradiso delle donne will be a kind of paradise for us also, I think. And I'm sure that you will all join me in welcoming Adelina. I just want to ask, because we're recording the lecture and also because we'd like to be able to hear Adelina clearly, please mute your microphones so that we don't have any unexpected interruptions, and the mute button is just down on the bottom left of your screen. Adelina is going to talk for about 45 minutes and there'll be time for questions afterwards. So you can either type your questions into the chat button at the bottom or unmute and just ask Adelina. So without further ado, please welcome Adelina Modesti.
Thank you very much, Esther. Yes, I'll share my screen now. Okay. So I'm going to talk about Bologna as a Paradiso delle donne, a paradise for women or of women, and look at these two artists, Lavinia Fontana and Elisabetta Sirani, as examples of women professional artists and looking at their practice in early modern Bologna. So Lavinia Fontana of Bologna is considered the first professional woman painter of Renaissance Italy, if not Europe, and proved an inspirational role model for her compatriot, the painter, printmaker and teacher, Elisabetta Sirani. Note that Elisabetta died very young at age 27 and was herself instrumental in the development of women's artistic practice during the 17th century, opening up her studio to female students, with her remarkable success influencing many other women who became professional artists in the following generations. Excuse me. The city of Bologna indeed could boast the largest single school of women artists in early modern Italy. Archival research has identified at least 68 women working in the city as sculptors, painters, printmakers, draftswomen and embroiderers from the 15th to the 18th centuries, a total not matched by any other artistic centre in the country. The factors why this proved to be the case will be addressed in this talk as we look at the achievements and legacy of these two successful women artists in the context of Bologna's tradition of learned and famous women. Bologna was a strategic North Italian town, the capital of Emilia-Romagna, and a major artistic centre and important papal state, second only to Rome. This ensured increased funding and patronage in the city from the Catholic Church for their building and artistic programs, especially after the Council of Trent, which sat from 1545 to 1563, spearheaded by the pastoral and artistic reforms of the Bolognese Bishop Cardinal Gabriele Paleotti. Churches, monasteries and convents were built or refurbished, requiring artists to decorate them with altarpieces or fresco cycles, whilst the rising middle class of merchants and professionals, along with the aristocracy, began amassing private art collections for their palaces and studios. Amongst the works a private citizen was sure to have in their home were small devotional pieces, whether paintings or prints of the Madonna or Holy Family and saints, as we see with Lavinia Fontana's Mystic Marriage of St. Catherine, which is recently acquired at the National Gallery of Victoria. A large part of Elisabetta Sirani's artistic production consisted of these small to medium domestic sacred images intended for private devotion, known as quadretti da letto, that is, pictures that hung over or near the bed to facilitate daily prayer. these are just a couple of further examples. Carlo Cesare Malvasia, Elisabetta's biographer, claimed that Elisabetta's many varied Madonnas were the most beautiful to be seen since those of Guidoreni, Bologna's most renowned artist. With regard to the saints, the penitent Magdalene, a favourite with Counter-Reformation preachers, patrons and artists, and St. John the Baptist were those most commissioned from Elisabetta by her many patrons, who ranged from artisans and merchants, such as the family fishmonger, to the elite of Bologna, and internationally, like the Medici of Florence and the King of Poland. It is documented that Elisabetta painted 7 versions of the Magdalene, whilst the Baptist features in about 16 of her known works. And she painted about 200 paintings in the space of 10, 11 years. So she was quite prolific. Such religious images in a domestic setting were intended as exemplary role models for the Catholic family, depicting contrition, repentance, and the Christian virtues of humility and charity. The kind of virtues advocated in images deployed by the Counter-Reformation Church in its fight against Northern Protestantism. Both Lavinia and Elisabetta painted large public altarpieces for the city's churches and religious institutions. Lavinia, in fact, was the first female artist to do so, whilst Elisabetta even produced altarpieces for Bologna's nearby territories, as we see in her 1657 Madonna of the Rosary. Elisabetta, even perhaps more so than her predecessor, specialised in grand history painting, whether classical or from the Bible. Historia or narrative painting was the most elevated of the artistic genres and the most lucrative, one in which women artists were generally discouraged from working as it was conceptually demanding. Women, since the classical period, had been considered intellectually inferior to men and not capable of artistic greatness or genius, a notion that the work of both Lavinia Fontana and Elisabetta Sirani belie. Elisabetta's monumental Baptism of Christ of 1658, it measures 380 by 490 centimetres, that is almost 5 by 4 metres, so it's very, very large, with its 33 life-size figures, marked Elisabetta's public debut in Bologna and was a turning point in her prolific but short-lived professional career, with commissions now starting to pour in from all around Italy and even Europe. The baptism was well received by Elisabetta's fellow citizens, judging by the many sonnets that were published in its honour, and which also praised the artist when the painting was exhibited in public before being placed in situ at the Certosa. Both women were also amongst the earliest to produce mythological pictures, with Lavinia the first female painter to depict the female nude, paving the way for Elisabetta, who clearly understood the female form and its anatomy and corporality, despite not being allowed to attend life drawing classes, these reserved for their male colleagues. There are also allegories, like this resplendent triumph of love for the 1661 Medici wedding in Florence to Cosimo III, to Princess Marguerite Louise d'Orléans, cousin of King Louis XIV of France. And both women were drawn to historical narratives that featured brave and heroic women, such as the story of the biblical widow Judith, who saved the Hebrew people by beheading the enemy Holofernes, general of the Assyrian army that had besieged their town Bethulia. And here we have 2 different episodes of the biblical narrative, the apocryphal narrative from the book of Judith. Lavinia shows us Judith just escaping from the tent, Holofernes' tent, after having beheaded Holofernes, and Elisabetta shows Judith triumphant, having returned to Betulia and displaying the head of Holofernes to her people. Elisabetta in particular specialised in these femme forte, or strong women, popular in the literature at the time, as seen in her Timoclea Thebana, or Timoclea of Thebes, and Portia, both drawn from Plutarch's Lives, a classical text that the artist could read in her father's well-furnished library. Timoclea of Thebes throws her rapist in the well. She then kills him by throwing stones at him. And Plutarch recounts this in the life of Alexander the Great. And the rapist was one of Alexander's captains who had raped the Theban woman, Timoclea. So she gets her just revenge. And it's interesting that Sirani chooses this particular moment to depict, because usually artists portrayed the Timoclea being brought before Alexander, who forgives her. So that tended to focus on male clemency, whereas Sirani concentrates on female ingenuity and her vengeance, so on the female heroine. Another important factor to consider is that Bologna was home to the oldest and most renowned university in Europe, which was established in 1088, as well as a number of academies, literary, scientific, and artistic. This intellectual culture attracted students from all around the continent, while artists engaged socially and collaborated professionally with the city's intelligentsia and wealthy patrons, resulting in the cultivated art that characterises the Bolognese school. Lavinia Fontana and Elisabetta Sirani were acknowledged by their contemporaries and subsequent writers as learned artists, and indeed they were well educated. It is this image as a learned noblewoman and artist, dressed in their finery and surrounded by the accoutrements of their knowledge, books, pen, inkwell, brush, classical sculpture, anatomical plaster casts, etc., that is depicted in their respective self-portraits, as the two women proudly gaze out of the paintings to engage the viewer. These two women artists both lived and worked in Bologna's intellectually stimulating and culturally rich environment, with their families mixing in Bologna's academic circles. Prospero Fontana, Lavinia's father, who had taught her to paint, for example, collaborated with his close friend, the naturalist Ulysses Agrovandi, on Gabriele Paleotti's influential treatise, Discourse on Sacred and Profane Images, of 1582, a counter-Reformation handbook that exhorted Christian artists to make the scriptures accessible to the faithful via realistic and clear visual narratives and decorous images. Prospero, a successful Mannerist artist and teacher, was also a member of the Accademia Bocchiana. Whilst his daughter Lavinia was chosen in 1590 by the above-mentioned Archbishop Paleotti and his brother Camillo to paint an altarpiece representing the Assumption of the Virgin for their family chapel at the Cathedral of St. Peter, Bologna, which chapel has since been destroyed. So the work is now found in Pieve di Cento. Lavinia herself produced portraits of Bologna's learned doctors, whilst Elisabetta designed their printed theses conclusions and book illustrations and frontispieces. We have two examples here. So Elisabetta Sirani would design the work, draw it, and other artists then produced it in print form. Elisabetta also portrayed the city's ecclesiastical elite and nobility, such as the funerary portrait of the Inquisitor General of Bologna, Guglielmo Focchi, and the nobility, including Bologna's renowned beauties, such as these two allegorical portraits, one as Saint Dorothy, the other one as Charity. Just as Lavinia Fontana had done before her. And Malvasia tells us that Lavinia actually, or that the women of Bologna vied to have their portrait painted by Lavinia, and she was renowned as a portraitist, especially of female women. Elisabetta Sirani's father, Giovanni Andrea Sirani, is believed to have been a member of Bologna's most learned society, the Accademia dei Gelati, and he was a professor of the Accademia del Nudo, where he taught life drawing to Bologna's male apprentices. Given the social and religious mores of the time, Elisabetta and other women aspiring to be professional artists were not permitted to partake of these lessons on anatomy or how to depict the nude figure, just as they could not attend the meetings of the more formalized academies, even if they were members. We know that both Lavinia and Elisabetta were members of the prestigious Accademia di San Luca, Rome, evidence of their professional standing. But unfortunately, they could not attend the meetings. Despite this limitation, which women artists did overcome by various means, as we saw with the painted nudes of both Lavinia and Elisabetta, for example, using family members as models or the mirror to examine their own bodies, or learning anatomy from plaster casts or wax models, it is to be highlighted that Bologna was a particularly supportive environment for women, especially in education and the creative arts. The city's civic, intellectual, and cultural identity was tied to its female citizenry, so much so that Bologna was described by one 17th century chronicler as un paradiso delle donne. Bolognese noble women played an active role in religious and civic life, as spiritual and social philanthropists, as members of Marian confraternities, as custodians of the city's miraculous images, as educators, as founders of female colleges, as caregivers of the city's conservatories and orphanages, and as patrons. Cardinal Gabriele Paleotti, for example, employed women in his post-Tridentine ministry, especially in charity work and as teachers of Christian doctrine. All this was given added impetus by humanist pro-feminist literature on the worth of women that promoted female education and their public engagement, such as Baldassare Castiglione's Book of the Courtier, begun in 1520, or texts that looked at the achievement of contemporary Italian women, like the Bolognese Nicolosa Sanuti's 1453 treatise against sumptuary laws, the first public defense of women written in Italy by a woman. Given early modern period secularization, the increase in female literacy, and the growing acceptance in counter-Reformation Bologna of women's professional and intellectual work as teachers in the elementary schools, in colleges and schools of Christian doctrine, where young girls were also educated, it does not come as a surprise that women also entered into other male-dominated professions, such as sculpture, painting, printmaking, or the book trade. Female learning had been historically celebrated in Bologna, with chroniclers extolling the virtues of its famed learned women for centuries, women jurists, linguists, and philosophers, like Bettisia Gozzardini, her dates are 1206 to 1261, and Dorothea Bucchi, active in 1350, who were believed to have studied and taught at the city's venerable university since the 13th century. Whilst this is perhaps more apocryphal than factual, for no women are documented in the matriculation rolls of the university until the 18th century, when indeed we do find them also teaching at Bologna studios, such as the physicist Laura Bassi or the anatomist wax sculptor Anna Morandi Mazzolini. The fact that Bolognese writers continually referred to these medieval women reveals that the city was proud of this female tradition, intellectual tradition. These same writers also praised women in the literary and other creative fields, and we do know that many published their own writings or became professional artists. Caterina Vigri, for example, we find that women artists had been active in Bologna since the 15th century, with Caterina Vigri, a nun artist, spiritual writer and musician, who founded the convent of the Poor Clares, known as Corpus Domini, in 1456. Whilst Vigri was believed to have painted a number of works depicting the Christ child in swaddling, an image that came to be associated with her, as we see here in this painting by Marcantonio Franceschini in the early 18th century. Her only confirmed extant works are the series of manuscript illustrations for her personal breviary, representing Christ, as we see here, the Virgin and saints. After her death, a cult grew around Caterina Vigri, and she was beatified in 1592 when she became the patron of Bolognese painters, while in 1710 she was nominated the patron saint of the Accademia Clementina, Bologna's recently founded Academy of Fine Art. An unusual choice, since the patron of painters was usually Saint Luke, who is often represented depicting the Virgin. That a female religious artist and writer had held this position is testament to the respect that creative women and intellectuals held in Bolognese society. Working within the confines of the cloister, mainly producing religious works for herself and her convent community, Caterina Vigri cannot, however, be considered a professional artist operating in the public arena. The path to professionalisation for Bolognese women artists working in competition with their male peers on the open market begins in the early 16th century with Propecia de Rossi, the first female sculptor in Italy and the only woman artist to receive a life of her own by Giorgio Vasari in his life of eminent sculptors, architects and painters, and the only woman artist to receive such an independent life of her own. In this 1550-68 biography, Vasari tells us that Propecia learnt to carve by miraculously working groups of figures on small peach stones, as we see in the Grassi family crest, in which there are about 12 carved peach stones. Quite a remarkable enterprise. But it was in the more ambitious work in marble that the sculptress excelled and gained public recognition. Vasari lists a number of such works and their patrons, though only these two marbles remain for us to see of her work. They belong to the major public commission to provide marble relief panels for the planned new facade of the Basilica of San Petronio, Bologna's most important church, circa 1525 to 26. They depict the Old Testament narrative of Joseph at the Egyptian court of the Pharaoh. Joseph rejects the advances of Potiphar's wife, and Potiphar's wife accuses Joseph. With Propecia de Rossi, the scene had been set for Bolognese women artists to take their professional place alongside their male colleagues, with their work receiving equivalent remuneration, as Propecia's payment records reveal. Later inventories identifying the paintings and drawings of Lavinia Fontana and Elisabetta Sirani also demonstrate that the value of their work compared well with that of their male peers. Just to give an example, remember the baptism of Christ that I showed earlier of 1658. Elisabetta received 1,000 lire bolognesi, a very high sum, equal to that her father had received for his 1655 painting for the same decorative cycle. The public success of Propecia de Rossi, followed by Lavinia Fontana, the first professional female artist of the Italian Renaissance, opened up further possibilities for women in the visual arts in Bologna, especially in the 17th century, when we begin to see an increase in the number of women artists working in the city. For example, Angela Granata, who died in 1613, the noblewoman Contessa Caterina Pepoli, who was active around 1617, and Antonia Pinelli, who died in 1644. Not much is known about the first two women, with no identifiable works remaining, though Granata is recorded as having paintings in both Bolognese and Mantuan collections. We know a little more about Antonia Pinelli, who began painting after Lavinia Fontana had left Bologna in 1604 to work at the papal court in Rome. Antonia was the wife of a painter, Giovanni Battista Bertuzio, and she trained with another male painter, Ludovico Carracci, one of the greats of the Bolognese school. Only a few of her works have come down to us, but she painted both private pictures and public altarpieces, as in this example, Miracle of St. John the Evangelist, signed and dated 1614, which was based on a design by her teacher, Ludovico. However, it is with Elisabetta Sirani, who began her independent career in 1654 at the age of 16 with this St. John, and the establishment of her art school for women and girls, together with her position as the most successful and collected woman artist to operate in early modern Bologna, by which she became an important role model for the many female followers in the second half of the century into the 18th century, that we find the full professionalisation of women's artistic practice in the city. Elisabetta, it should be noted, as I mentioned earlier, completed over 200 canvases, 11 prints, and almost 150 extant drawings in a professional career that spanned just over a decade. Hence, she was extremely prolific and painted very quickly with elan and masculine bravura, skills which she demonstrated to a perhaps sceptical public by opening her studio to her many patrons and clients so they could watch her working. Most of these works she registered in a diary titled Note of the Paintings Made by Me, Elisabetta Sirani, dating from 1655 to 1665, in which subject matter, names of clients, and her ideas for each work are identified. It is an important documentary source for reconstructing the artist's oeuvre and patronage networks. Elisabetta's notebook itself, which has the original manuscript has gone missing, but was published by Malvasia in 1678 in his Felsina Pittrice, Lives of the Bolognese Painters, which also includes Elisabetta's biography and her eulogy. I would like finally to say something about women's artistic training during the early modern period, so as to demonstrate just how revolutionary Elisabetta Sirani's artistic and teaching practice was. As already mentioned, women could not attend academic meetings or life drawing classes. They thus had few avenues for artistic training. Either as a nun artist working from the protection of the convent, as Caterina Vigri had done in the 15th century. Such women were largely self-taught and sometimes trained other nuns, as Suor Plautilla Nelli did in Florence during the 16th century at the convent of Santa Caterina. Or as noble women who could afford a private tutor to teach them, often a male artist. Considered noble amateurs, their elevated social status ensured a degree of education and entree into European diplomatic circles, where they received elite patronage and sometimes court positions. Sofonisba Anguissola is perhaps the most well-known of these noble amateur artists. Her family was minor nobility from the Lombard town of Cremona, and her father Amilcare took the unprecedented step to have her train as a painter with Bernardino Campi and later Bernardino Gatti. Sofonisba became court painter of the Habsburgs in Spain, with her salary contingent on her post as lady-in-waiting to Queen Isabella Valois, whom she taught to draw and paint, alongside other members of the royal household. Whilst internationally successful and famous, Sofonisba cannot be considered a professional artist, for she did not receive payment for her artistic work. It's to be noted that none of these three women hailed from artist families. They were all nobility. Belonging to a family of artists was one of the more accessible means for women to be trained and enter the profession. Thus, the aspiring professional woman artist, whose ambition was to embrace a career in which she operated on the public market in competition with her male peers, was more often than not trained by a male family member, either their husband, brother or father in the family workshop. This was the case with Lavinia Fontana and Elisabetta Sirani, as well as the Roman painter Artemisia Gentileschi, all daughters of successful artists who taught them before they became independent professional artists in their own right, running their own workshops and thereby occupying a studio of their own. Elisabetta first took charge of the Sirani family workshop around 1662, when her father could no longer paint due to illness, and she then established her own studio and art school. Elisabetta thus became the Sirani family's primary breadwinner. Lavinia Fontana before her also supported her large family with her work, and I must point out that Lavinia gave birth to 11 children, though only, I think, two or three survived into adulthood. And Lavinia's husband, Zappi, acted as her studio assistant and agent. Elisabetta's father, Giovanni Andrea Sirani, was an accomplished painter and printmaker, successful teacher and art merchant, who had been Guido Reni's most trusted assistant. Reni, who had died in 1642, it must be recalled, was Bologna's most highly regarded Baroque artist. You see here one of his works on the left. Giovanni Andrea taught Elisabetta in the elegant Reni manner in which he himself had been trained. Initially, Giovanni Andrea also began teaching his two young daughters, Barbara and Anna Maria, who then completed their studies with their elder sister, Elisabetta. As well as learning to paint effortlessly, Elisabetta became a consummate draftswoman, whether in brush and ink wash, as in the study for the baptism of Christ, or in red or black chalk and pastel. Giovanni Andrea also taught Elisabetta the latest printing techniques in etching, known as acquaforte. Elisabetta presented some of these prints as thank you gifts to her patrons for work they had commissioned from her, as we see here on the right, which is dedicated to the patron's wife. The gifting of her work was one of the strategies Elisabetta used to cultivate goodwill with her patrons and to generate further commissions, a diplomatic strategy that often bore fruit. Another promotional strategy, self-fashioning her identity as both a woman and a professional artist, was the clever use of her signature, ingeniously hidden in the illusionistic fabric of her paintings, on cushion braids, collars, cuffs, buttons, or inscribed into the architectural elements of her paintings. To date, it is estimated that circa 70% of Elisabetta's extant work is signed, quite a number given that the male artists in Bologna rarely signed their paintings. In her signatures, the never married Elisabetta did not identify herself in relation to her male authority figure, that is her father Giovanni Andrea. Instead, she signed herself with her own individual name, variations of Elisabetta Sirani fecit, thereby announcing her independent professional identity separate from her father, as indeed her biographer Malvasia confirmed was her intention. Elisabetta Sirani therefore represents a new social category that was emerging during this period, the single professional woman who chooses a career over marriage and motherhood. Lavinia Fontana was likewise aware of her position as an exceptional woman artist in a male-dominated profession, also signing her paintings, but almost always in relation to her male significant other, reflecting her changing social identity, either as an unmarried woman and daughter of Prospero Fontana. So you read Lavinia Virgo Prosperi Fontana figlia, daughter, ex speculo imaginem. And then after her marriage in 1577, as the wife of Giovanni Paolo Zappi, so Lavinia Fontana de Zappi Fecibat. Only in a few instances did she sign herself autonomously with her maiden name, Lavinia Fontana Facibat, as in the NGV copper. In Bologna, we find that women also trained with male artists, not from their immediate family, as we saw earlier with Antonia Pinelli, who had been a pupil of Ludovico Carracci, even though her husband was a painter and would have been able to teach her, to train her. This was an unusual phenomenon, but one that became more diffused in Bologna during the second half of the 17th century, when more and more women artists, some of whom had trained with Elisabetta Sirani, found a space of their own in the male studios of the city. For example, Camilla Lauteri, who you see on the right, went on after Elisabetta's death in 1665 to continue her training with Carlo Cignani, one of the early presidents of the Accademia Clementina. What the above methods of professional artistic training for women represent is a patrilineal model of education from male to female. The master is the male teacher while the student is female, just as the artist with a capital A is usually conceptualized as male, with woman as the subject of his art, his model. Elisabetta Sirani, who was recognized as a maestra by her contemporaries who considered her the best brush in Bologna, is known to have taught her two sisters, younger sisters, Barbara and Anna Maria. The work of Anna Maria more approaches the accomplished style of her elder sister Elisabetta, and she is clearly a better painter than Barbara. Both younger sisters specialised in public altarpieces, though they were also known to have produced small devotional pieces for private consumption, though few are extant. Elisabetta also assisted Ginevra Cantofoli, excuse me, providing designs for Cantofoli's work and even retouching her finished pieces, as she's known to have done for this work. Ginevra, who was a noblewoman and much older than Elisabetta, had earlier trained as a miniature painter, but after being sustained and aided by the younger artist, as Lazia tells us, she moved on to painting large public altarpieces, as we see here. Other professional women artists who most probably studied with Elisabetta include Lucrezia Scarfaglia, flourished in 1677, Lucrezia Bianchi, born around 1650, Caterina Mongardi, 1645 to 1680, and Veronica Franchi, born around about 1650. Franchi started painting by 1663, producing, like her maestra Elisabetta, mainly classical history painting and mythologies, but also religious works and portraits, all unfortunately lost. So to conclude, Elisabetta Sirani built her art practice on the success and reputation already achieved by Lavinia Fontana. But she went even further than her predecessor in establishing alternative modes of artistic training for women. Elisabetta's studio, which also functioned as a cultural salon, was open to all women, noble women as well as girls from artist families, whom she taught painting and or printmaking, and who all went on to become professional artists in Bologna and throughout Italy. In so doing, Elisabetta Sirani overturned the traditional male to female model of artistic training undertaken by Lavinia Fontana and herself to establish a matrilineal pedagogic methodology, one in which the transmission of cultural capital, knowledge and technical expertise was mediated by and through women. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adelina. That was a really comprehensive and fascinating talk. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? While people are thinking, I have one. So you mentioned her, Elisabetta Sirani's workshop, which it seems she kind of took over from her father when he retired. Is that correct?
Yes, he didn't retire totally. He still taught and still acted as an art merchant, but he didn't paint. He had arthritic gout in his hands, so he couldn't hold a paintbrush. So she took over, yes.
So I imagine that would have consisted largely of male apprentices and workers at that time, would it?
Yes, that's in 1662, yes. And she'd already, I think, believed by then she would have had Ginevra Cantofoli as an assistant because she painted her portrait in 1659. So I believe they were already acquainted. And I think some of the other women artists would have been young girls or I sort of think of Sirani's school almost like a kindergarten in terms of embracing young girls, where they wouldn't have been able to go to male artists to be taught, but they were taught by a female. And then they did after she died, there wasn't anyone really capable, not even her two younger sisters capable of teaching. And they went on to other male studios in the city.
So I guess the question I was leading to is, are there any records of how those male apprentices or workers took to being ordered about by a female?
Well, it's interesting because there is trial testimony. She was believed to have been poisoned by her domestic. And in the trial testimony, the male apprentices give testimony and they say they knew her very, very well. And I saw her every day. And so you get a sense that it was almost like a brother-sister relationship. It was a family workshop, but there's nothing to indicate how they felt about being taught or at least led by a woman. Yeah. No, I have nothing. We don't even have documented confirmation that a lot of the women artists that have been said to have been taught by Sirani were taught by her. It's mainly later writers who give a long list of about 11, but I don't think it was that many. I think it was only a handful. Yeah.
Can you read Adrian's question at the bottom there? Yeah.
Yes, you mentioned some women artists could be members of the guild or academy and not attend the meetings. Were these exclusions and inclusions discussed at the time? Thanks, Adrian, and hello. How are you? Yes, they couldn't attend them. They were in the statutes of the actual academy. Statutes would stipulate there could be women artists admitted to membership, but they could not attend any of the meetings or the classes that were held in the academy. Discussed at the time, well, it's interesting because Elisabetta Sirani's own father was a professor at an academy del nudo, and no women could have attended that. So it was just taken for granted. You know, women, it would have been unthinkable for a woman to attend a male life drawing class, the nude male. But they did use their own bodies, and they would have used their little sisters or whatever. They would have studied the female nude. And that's why you get such a good representation by Sirani and Lavinia Fontana as well. Yeah.
Michael has his hand up for a question.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Yes.
Thanks very much, Adelina. My question actually relates to the patrons of these artists, and I noticed actually when looking at the provenance of a number of the works you showed, they're now in quite major collections in Italy. Do you know much about the patrons, particularly, say, in terms of not only the church, but perhaps some other professional patrons? And when did their works start to be collected for, say, national institutions?
Okay, we do know a lot about the patrons, especially for Sirani because of her notebook. She actually listed who her clients were and her patronage networks, so we could sort of map out her patronage networks. And they were from all social levels. She mentions her fishmonger, though I've been able to identify who he is. She doesn't identify him. There were, the dilettante noble nobility who also went to the artist to learn how to draw and paint. There were the professors, the university doctors, the professors. Bologna, being a university town, it had a lot of patronage to do with book illustrations and thesis conclusions and portraits of the scholars. Lavinia Fontana in particular did a lot of portraits of the male scholars of the city, the professors. And there were the noblemen and the noblewomen, and then aristocracy, and also like the King of Poland or the Duchess of Brunswick, so it's far wide and express. Lavinia Fontana went to Rome and had the Pope as her patron. So yes, they were well connected, very well connected, especially with Lavinia, with her father already being connected with Paleotti, Cardinal Paleotti, and yeah. And the final part of the question was, when were they started to be collected by the national institutions? Well, you have Napoleonic suppression invasion at the end of the 18th into the 19th century. And a lot of the works were hidden away, and a lot of the works were taken away to France. But you have the establishment of the Academy of Fine Art with Academia Clementina in the early 18th century. And they were started to be collected for the institutions then. But already before then, the private collector, the private patron, was collecting in the 16th and 17th century. And the 17th century saw a surge of private patronage, private collection. Yeah.
Yeah. No, thanks very much.
We have a question from Ruth McLaren, who asks, were the models in the life drawing classes usually men? And
yeah.
Is this why women couldn't attend?
That's still up in the air in terms of Bologna. With the Karachi Academy, they think that there might have been female models as well, but mainly the models were male, yes. what women were not allowed, couldn't attend because of decorum and chastity and all those sorts of virtues.
And there's also another comment and question from Adrian. Can you see that one?
Scholarly tradition and women artists in Bologna. You mentioned Padua. Padua, we don't have much work done on Padua, so we don't, which is interesting because it's also a university town. But Rome, we have a large contingent of women artists in the 17th century who worked around the Barberini, were patronised by the Barberini. So you have Virginia d'Avezzo, I mean Artemisia Gentileschi, of course, Corvi, I mean Maddalena Corvi, Plautilla Bricci, who was an architect, first woman architect in the history of Western art, and she was a painter and an architect. So Venice, there's a research group doing work on Venice now, starting to find women artists, Giulia Lama, or Rosalba Carriera, of course, but other artists that we don't know of. And then there were the nun artists. I mean, we're finding more and more nun artists as research is being done.
Giovanna Garzoni.
Giovanna Garzoni, who worked in the various courts in Italy and went to Paris as well. She settled in Rome. She came from the Marches, Le Marche, and she settled in Rome and left her estate and drawings and etc. to the Accademia Clementina. She was very much, not Clementina, sorry, the Accademia di San Luca. She was very much associated with the Accademia di Clementina, giving gifts, and the records state her contribution. Yeah.
I have a few more questions, but they'd probably open up a whole new lecture or can of worms.
That's all right.
So, one was, you mentioned that it was really in the 17th century that women artists started to proliferate. What changed in that century to make conditions more amenable to that?
Well, in Bologna, it was the end of the 16th century into the 17th century with the Counter-Reformation, which you would think that the Counter-Reformation will be more repressive, but in fact, a lot of things came out of the Counter-Reformation that were very positive for women. For example, they decreed that women could not be forced into convents. They had to go on their own free will. So they had to wait till they were 18 to make that commitment. Women could apply to have their marriages annulled or divorced. And that was something that was occurring as well. So as far as the artists go and artworks, the church, was a major patron. So you begin to see, but in Bologna, it's always had that tradition of intellectual tradition of women in public life, and women working in the schools, teaching the schools of Christian doctrine, founding the colleges, charity work. Paleotti employed women. Paleotti's own mother was a learned woman, was a poet, I think, a writer. So he was very much, female education was very paramount. So if you've got female education, and an acceptance of women in public life, you're going to find more women entering into whole new fields. And women weren't restricted to just marrying or entering the convent. There were groups of women who established their own communities that didn't want to marry and were teachers or writers or artists.
Well, a question that would probably follow on from there, Robin has just asked, were women at all innovative in their use of colour and technique, etc.?
This brings up the whole question of, is there a feminine style, which is being debated. Yes and no. Sirani was particularly innovative in her representation of women and in choosing the subject matter and the particular narrative event that male artists didn't normally choose. Either if it was with the Judith, because the 17th century, the more representative image of Judith was the actual horrific decapitation of Holofernes. And Sirani seems to go back to an earlier tradition, literary tradition, dramatic tradition, where the triumph of Judith was popularised in sacra rappresentazioni, in sacred plays. And so she uses a very theatrical, if you remember the image, it's a very theatrical stage set like image where she's very majestically demonstrating the head of Holofernes to her people. She chose works from classical history, from, as I said, from Plutarch, again with Portia. I didn't explain about Portia. Portia was the wife of Brutus, who was plotting the assassination of Julius Caesar. Portia realised something was going on with her husband and wanted to be let in on whatever secret he was holding, and that to prove her constancy of strength, able to keep a secret, she stabbed her thigh. Now, other artists represented her suicide, Portia's suicide, eating hot coals, ingesting hot coals. Guidoreni did one, Pierre Mignard did one. Sirani chooses the moment where Portia is alone with her own domestic workers in the background, but she's separated from them. She's in another sphere. She's not in a domestic sphere, she's in a political sphere. And other artists, when represent her stabbing herself, show her stabbing in her foot and not her thigh. I think Sirani is the first and only, the first to show her stabbing her thigh. So she does these sort of inventive iconographic details that other artists hadn't looked at. Yeah. Use of colour. Sirani was known as a colourist, and she was being influenced by the Venetians in that respect. Artemisia Gentileschi, for example, we don't think of her as a colourist now, but she was praised not for her Caravaggioism, her following Caravaggio's dark style, but was praised by her contemporary critics for her colouring. I don't think you can sort of, with representations, interpretations, yes, but I think with actual style, I don't think you can identify a feminine style. It was more to do with the choice of subject matter. that you can, and women were relegated because they couldn't paint from the male nude. They really weren't painting history paintings, which both Sirani and Fontana did, and Gentileschi did. They were relegated to floral, painting what was around them, the domestic sphere, and floral painting. And that's why they say it's a woman's art. It's not a male art. But you look at Dutch painting and it's full of floral paint, and it's not as simple as that. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Thank you so much, Adelina. I'll just pass on to Michael to end our session.
Thank you, Esther.
Yeah, thanks very much, Esther, and to Adelina, thank you very much for a really fantastic talk, and I certainly learned a lot about painting from early Bologna during that, and of course the relationship of these women artists. It's interesting that it's very topical, of course, here in Melbourne with the National Gallery purchasing its first Lavinia Fontana. And I also noticed, in fact, that the National Gallery actually has a drawing by Elisabetta Sirani in its collection. Yes, I know. And when you look at the drawing, you'd wonder, wouldn't you? But anyway,
no, the drawing is fine. The dating is out. The date has 1668 on the back of it, and she's died by 1665. So I wonder whether it's not by her sister Barbara rather than by Elisabetta. So the drawing itself is fine.
Mm. So, and it's not always on display, this one, I guess.
No, they're not on display.
Yeah.
The drawings, unfortunately, have to be kept hidden
Yes.
away from light and that, so they'll only bring them out for certain exhibitions or things like that. Yeah.
So maybe we will see it in due course as the interest increases in
You can always make an appointment to see it. They will pull it out for you.
So thank you again, Adelina. A wonderful lecture, and really do appreciate your support for the art history alumni and providing us some really food for thought there. So to everyone, thank you for attending today. This is being recorded, and it will go on our YouTube channel. I think it's the Trobe Uni YouTube channel at some stage. So anyone who's missed this and would like to be able to see it, or you'd like to see it again, it will be up and running in a short time. We hope to be having another couple of events in the next month or so, possibly looking at going to see the Nolan exhibition at Heidi, and we certainly are looking to have a program around the Picasso exhibition coming to the National Gallery in a couple of weeks. Otherwise, thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next Art History alumni event. Thanks very much.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.